Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm Simon Hearn. I'm a performance architect at Akamai, which is a content delivery network, but I'm not going to talk about content delivery networks today. What I want to do is take a step back from what is traditionally quite a technical mindset. We see web performance as optimizing bits and bytes and milliseconds. But I want to think about the psychology that we're trying to influence. What are we trying to achieve? There's no value in making the fastest website in the world because that would be a blank page. What we're trying to do is deliver better experiences. And if we want to deliver better experiences, we need to understand the psychology of our visitors and how they react to the different experiences we deliver to them. Now, it wouldn't be a web performance talk without some case studies, and these are taken from wpostats.com. But when you read through these, it's kind of hard to work out whether they're causal or whether they're correlations. So with the FT, for example, they increased user engagement when they released a faster website. The website was designed differently as well. So it brings a question to mind. Why does speed matter? Why do we do this in the first place? And when I started working in performance 8 or 9 years ago, I kind of got obsessed with optimizing for specific metrics. We were still looking at page load back then, but then DOM content loaded, first content for paint, and it feels like a bit of a game. What releases have a positive effect on those metrics? And then kind of assuming that everything would be better if we improve them. So what I want to look at is more, why do slow websites feel bad? And how can we alleviate some of those feelings in our visitors? And hopefully there are some tips and tricks in here which aren't difficult to implement, but help us deliver an experience that feels fast. If you can't be fast, fake it. And to be honest, it doesn't matter. If the user feels like they're getting a better experience, that's a positive outcome. So speed and web performance is actually all about waiting. It's waiting for content to arrive in your browser, waiting for it to hit your eyes, and for you to get that dopamine hit that you've got the content that you're expecting to see. And the opposite of that is having to wait a long time, which we all know is a negative feeling. But it turns out we know a lot about waiting. And if we look at psychological research, there's even studies on the psychology of waiting lines. Now, this blog post slash non-peer-reviewed paper looked at the psychology of waiting lines in the physical world. Well, apart from voting and waiting for COVID tests, we don't have much waiting in lines at the moment, but we do in the virtual world. And a lot of this can be applied. So in the introduction, the abstract, there's this great statement. Waiting is frustrating, demoralizing, agonizing, aggravating, annoying, time-consuming, and incredibly expensive. That's a lot of negative adjectives for something that seems so mundane. But from this article, I've distilled 3 rules for the psychology of waiting on the web. And we'll go through them and look at how we can influence them and why they're important to our visitors. The first one is that unoccupied time feels longer than occupied time. And this is the reason that you take out your phone once you know you're waiting for more than 30 seconds. It's to occupy your time so it feels like it's moving faster. Anxiety makes waits feel longer. So when you're anxious about something, like waiting for a doctor's appointment or a flight that's been delayed, that time stretches out and it feels more painful. And finally, unknown waits feel longer than known waits. If you know you're going to be waiting for 5 minutes, you can mentally prepare for that. If you don't know whether it's going to be 5, 10, or 15 minutes, it causes a subconscious reaction, negative reaction, which makes it feel longer and more painful. So let's look at how we can apply this to the web. The core principle is humans hate wasted time. Naturally, we want to be doing something all the time, which is why meditation is such a tough skill to learn. So in order for us to engage our visitors, we need to give feedback nearly instantly, 100 milliseconds, a little bit faster than the blink of an eye. We need to update when a customer is waiting, a visitor is waiting, every 1 second to keep their attention. And the golden rule of web performance, we need to complete actions within 3 seconds. Now, this research was published in 1968. Funnily enough, our brain physiology hasn't changed much since then, and these metrics still stand. So let's talk about the first task, making sure people feel like their time is occupied. This is one of my favorite anecdotes. It's about an office block in New York, which had elevators to get from floor to floor. And the tenants, the companies that were leasing office space there, complained to building management that the elevators took too long in peak time. It could take 3 or 4 minutes to get an elevator to go down to get your lunch. And this felt like a huge waste of time. So the building management company got together, got an engineering firm to research how they could install new elevators or make them faster. It turned out to be not economically possible. It was such an old building that retrofitting elevators was not, or new elevators was not going to be possible. So as we're having this meeting, there happened to be a psychology undergraduate who was in for another project. And they gave him the task of making the time that the customers were waiting feel shorter. And after a few hours or days of thinking about this, he decided to install sticky back mirrors next to the elevator buttons. Within a week, there were no more complaints. Just having a mirror there so you could check your tie, check your hair was okay, check yourself out in the mirror, meant that the time felt more occupied. So it felt like it was passing quicker. And we can apply this concept to the web. On the web, we need to show something fast. We need to fill those UX gaps that plague us. Every time you interact, there's a small gap. And the more we can fill that, the shorter the time feels. And we need to prioritize what matters to the visitor. And this isn't necessarily the same thing as what matters to the website owner. Publisher is a great example of this. They want to see, a customer wants to see the news article, not the ads. Whereas, of course, the publisher wants the ads to be out as soon as possible. Now, I'm going to pick on CNN for 2 slides here. So this is the international edition of CNN. And I'm guessing most of you are familiar with waterfall charts from web page test. So you will notice the first chunk of HTML at 1 second and the first paint at 4 seconds. This 3-second gap is wasted time. The browser has content that it could render, isn't allowed to. And as we saw earlier, 3 seconds is the golden rule. Beyond that, you're going to start losing visitors to bouncing away, getting distracted and moving to a different tab. So to show what you've got, it is relatively simple in theory, quite hard to implement in practice. That means no blocking scripts, no blocking tag managers, no blocking optimization scripts, no blocking first-party scripts like a React library, and no external CSS. So the browser won't render anything if it sees a link rel style sheet until it's downloaded and parsed that style sheet. And ideally, an HTML document that's less than 50 kilobytes. So I realize we're getting technical here, but these are just 3 simple steps to ensure that the browser can render as soon as it gets some content. Otherwise, we end up with that 3-second gap that we saw earlier. Speaking of gaps, Slack is a good example of a slow app. It's an Electron app, which means it's Chrome wrapped in a desktop app. I think this is from Windows, but what they know is that the desktop app is slow. And you know the Slack app is slow as well. It's got faster recently, but it's not the fastest loading experience. And they do 3 things to keep you engaged. One is this kind of skeleton UI that gives a rough but not accurate idea of what the UI will look like. And it doesn't need to be accurate. It just needs to give you the impression that you're in the right app. The second thing they do is give you a message in the middle. You'll notice if you're a Slack admin, you can update these messages and keep them fresh, which means that mentally you know that it might be different from the last time you saw it, so you're more likely to try to read it. Now that may only take half a second or a second, but it's active time. It's filling that user experience gap. And the third one, which is really nice nod to functionality, is giving the user an option to fix something. If it doesn't work, or if this loading screen hangs for 5-10 seconds, you have an action you can take rather than just closing the app. So it builds this trust that eventually you're going to get the app that you asked for. Now, games have been doing this for years. In the mid-90s, Namco were granted this patent in the US to run an auxiliary game. This is because they knew that the time it took to load a game from a cartridge into the console's memory was long enough to put people off playing it. And they found out that if they gave users a really quick, simple, lightweight game that they could play while waiting for the main game to load, they were much more likely to finish loading the game, and they were more likely to spend longer playing the game. We can learn a lot from games in this kind of respect. And in fact, you probably have seen this in action. Why do you think Chrome gives us the Dino game? Well, partly is a fun engineering project, but also if there's a momentary lapse in connectivity, something that would normally resolve in a few minutes, this game keeps you in the Chrome ecosystem. It keeps you in the web browser and encourages you not to leave and go somewhere else and forget what you were doing. And we can take this approach and build it into our websites, not just the browser. Now, prioritizing what matters, this is a screenshot taken from a talk given by Patrick Hammond maybe 4 years ago now when he was working at The Guardian. And in their UI rebuild project, they decided to focus on what matters first to the customer. So in tiny font down here, you can see the green box surrounds the headline of the article. This is a publisher, the hero image, and the body text. This was all included in the first HTML response that show what you've got concept. Everything else is additional, it's secondary. It's not necessary to give a great user experience. So they prioritized that content and delivered it first, and then progressively enhanced, depending on what size the browser was, what capabilities it had, to add this extra business content which users might interact with later on. So we can measure this. We can measure how fast we get that first user experience. In synthetic tools like web page test, we have time to title. This gives us an idea of how well structured our head is, but it also tells us everything that the browser needs to do to update the tab, the address bar, to show you the title of the page. And that's the first indication the customer has that they're looking at the right thing, clicked on the right link. Then first contentful paint or first paint for browsers that don't support FCP tells us when the browser was able to render something to the screen. And if you have large blocking scripts or third parties which take 500, 1000 milliseconds to respond, that will push out your FCP. And then we have hero element timers. So the element timing API isn't widely supported yet, but we can measure when our text is rendered, when our hero image is rendered, when the thing that we know is important is rendered in front of our customer. Okay, moving on to number 2, wait anxiety. Now you've probably read this article before, but 70% of these crosswalk buttons don't do anything. The majority of these don't work just because they're legacy and the traffic light systems have been upgraded to be fully automatic. But in London, they've actually installed placebo buttons because the psychological research shows that people want to feel in control. And even if the button does nothing to affect the timing of the lights, pressing it gives the customer, the user, the pedestrian, a feeling of control. It makes the wait time feel shorter and it reduces complaints. So again, let's look at how we can do this on the web. If you've ever been around a grandparent or someone of the older generation using a mobile device on the web, you might hear them say things like, did that work? Can I click on it yet? And is this broken? Now, all of these are phrases we associate with anxiety or distress. And it happens a lot on the web. But without attaching an electroencephalographs to everyone's heads, we can't measure that directly. So what we need to do is optimize for it and measure it through proxies. To reduce it, we need to maintain visual stability. We'll go into that in a bit more detail. Use optimistic UI patterns that are tolerant of failure and give user feedback. Now, this is probably the easiest thing to implement through this whole talk. I'll spend quite a lot of time on that. Now back to CNN. So remember, it takes about 4 seconds to render. There we go. In about 8 seconds, we get our images. So now it feels like the page is complete. So I'm going to go try to click on something, and everything is shifted because the hero ad banner didn't have allocated space. And this has caused an unexpected layout shift. And by unexpected, I mean the customer didn't interact with the page leading to that shift. It was a shift caused by elements not being sized properly or layout not being made appropriately for content that was going to be downloaded asynchronously. Now we know this is bad. We hate that feeling when we try to click on something and the button is shifted. And it feels kind of malicious. So to reduce layout shifts, there's probably 5 things we can do. The most common thing I see in the wild is web fonts affecting layout shift. This is because the fallback font, the system font, doesn't have exactly the same character width or character spacing or line spacing as the web font, which means that when the web font loads, the characters shift slightly, and if they overflow by a line, that's a massive layout shift cascade throughout the page. There's two ways to fix it. The sad frowny face is for block, which is don't show text until you have the web font. That means you can guarantee there won't be a layout shift. But if your web font is slow, you've got invisible text, which is not good for accessibility and not resilient to failure. The other option, which is more common but kind of a little bit more risky, is to use font display optional. So if the browser has the web font when it goes to render it, it will use it. If it doesn't have a web font when it's rendering text, it will use the system font and not update it until the next page view. Now, if you combine font display optional with link rel preload these font files, you can get a good balance between performance and layout shifts. Ad slots, probably the second most common reason for layout shifts. If you can pre-allocate the size, the space, most ad slots are fixed size. The risk is that if someone's using an ad blocker, or if there are no ad slots, no bids for that ad slot, then you won't have an ad to show there. So the worst case scenario is there's no ad and there's some empty space. Now this can be replaced with a first-party banner, a first-party ad slot, either requesting someone subscribe, turn off that ad blocker, or just a current promotion. So pre-allocating those slots will prevent that layout shift we saw on CNN. Classic one that should be so simple, but can be really hard in production. Size attributes on images, so the browser knows how to lay out the page before downloading the first few bytes of the image and getting the metadata. Now, one that seems like a pretty simple fix in a new project, but quite hard with a legacy project, is border box for box sizing, which means that if you add a border to an element on hover or on an active state, it doesn't change the size that that element contains. And finally, for some websites with dynamic content, if the initial view doesn't overflow, then you won't get a scroll bar on some browsers. If you know that you're probably going to eventually overflow the page, you can force the scroll bar so it doesn't appear as the content downloads and shift your content by adding that 10, 20 pixel scroll bar on the side. Now, this is something that you may have noticed, but not really thought about. The Twitter UI has an optimistic UI pattern for interactions. When you click on the like button, you get instant glorious feedback and a lovely animation, which of course is customized for things like the PS5 launch. But how did they make it so instant? Well, it turns out that when you click, here's my click event down here, it immediately triggers the animation. Now this animation is 300 milliseconds long. In the meantime, the actual API call to make that like has completed. It took 180 milliseconds in this case. So the animation fires no matter what. Even if that API call fails, the animation fires and you get your feedback instantly. And in fact, if you turn off your internet connection, you'll find that you can still submit likes on tweets. And actually, they build up a queue. So there's a queue built up in IndexedDB that when they next get connectivity, they'll submit all of those likes. Eventually, this will fail and it'll undo them in the UI. But it's a great way to be resilient to poor connectivity. Another simple optimistic UI pattern for an e-commerce website, in this case, Allbirds, is something that's traditionally quite expensive. So when you add something to cart, it's an API call that you cannot cache. And it normally has to go back to origin to verify stock, to update your basket value, maybe calculate shipping costs as well. Oftentimes that means the user's left with this UX gap. They click add to basket, and then they get no feedback for half a second. What Allbirds do is immediately slide out the cart with kind of skeleton UI patterns to show you what it's going to look like. Meantime, in that 250 milliseconds or so it takes to animate, they've got halfway through the round trip, submitting the API call and getting the data back, which means that by the time the response is there, UI elements are ready, and it's a much nicer experience than having to wait for the extra 300 milliseconds to get any response from the UI at all. So it just feels like a better way to do it. You don't have to implement a whole new cart UI to do this, though. It can be as simple as giving feedback on a button. Now, this is actually doing two things. It's giving feedback when you click with an animation, and then the context of your action is kept in the button. When we're giving user feedback, keeping it in context is critical. The user doesn't want to have to look up in the top right-hand corner of their screen to check that the basket value has incremented by 1. Their focus is on the button, so why not put your updates there? When you add an animation, you buy about 250 to half a second of users' patience. You can be distracted for that long by an animation. And oftentimes this is long enough to make those critical API calls, get the data you need, and update the UI fully after your animation. And an active state is a really quick fix. So, half a line of CSS goes from, did I click that or not? Am I waiting for something? To, I've got a purple border. Purple's my favorite color, which is why it's everywhere. But that really simple fix helps to give the user more feedback that you have accepted their intent. They've done something and you've given them feedback to say, yes, I felt you click that button. I'm doing something with it. Bear with me. So to reduce anxiety on the web, we need to maintain visual stability. Use optimistic UI patterns that are resilient to failure, and give user feedback. And this is the most important thing. A customer just wants to be, or a visitor just wants to be heard. They just want to know that you can hear what they're trying to tell you through the website. And that user feedback bit is critical. Now, number 3 is uncertain waits feel longer than certain waits. And none of us have probably been to a theme park recently, but you'll remember these wait time signs. What I find interesting about them is not that they're giving you this 45-minute time. That's not what's important. What is important is that you can guarantee it'll be quicker than 45 minutes. Because what they're doing is setting expectation low, so in reality, they can impress. So if you're expecting it to take 45 minutes, you get to the end of the queue after half an hour, you think, great, I won back 15 minutes of my life. Whereas if you had no expectation of time, half an hour would feel like a really long wait. So setting these expectations gives our lizard brain, our limbic brain, the ability to plan and prepare. So if we can do this on the web, we can make waits feel shorter. So on the web, we have, am I in the right place? I'm uncertain as to how long this is going to take and whether I've actually clicked on the right link or not. And how long is this going to take? Should I switch tabs over to Facebook? Should I put my phone back in my pocket and go back to what I was doing? And is it broken? Do I need to refresh the page? If you look at refresh rates captured through your analytics, you'll find the pages with the highest refresh rates, as in people loading the same page over and over again, will be the ones with the worst UI patterns. So to create certainty, there's a few simple tricks. Anchoring your user, I'll go into a bit more detail into what that means. Giving timelines. It's kind of hard to do on the web, but it's possible. And we can set those expectations so people can be delighted by delays rather than frustrated. And then active listening and feedback. Something which is in every parenting book is active listening. And we can apply those techniques to the web. So the biggest and easiest user anchor to let the user know they're in the right place is a site logo. So this Forbes page is an ANT page, but if you forget that for now, you'll notice that the first render is immediately after the HTML is downloaded. And what that gives you is a non-functional menu button and the site logo. The non-functional menu button is kind of irrelevant because it's unlikely a visitor is going to click on that button until the content's loaded. But giving you that logo straight away tells the customer they're in the right place. And it can be a really nice, pleasant surprise to get that really quickly. An alternative to this is a splash screen. And if you know that you're going to show a splash screen or a site logo for between 1 and 3 seconds, that's going to be a positive experience. Beyond 3 seconds, showing a splash screen makes it feel like the app has crashed. There's a real balance to be had. Now, I'm actually wearing some socks from the sock shop right now, so I'm a brand advocate. But it's something that's relatively expensive to do, which is to filter search results. So here I'm searching for men's socks, and I'm filtering by purple. Now, traditionally, you click on that button, and you'd wait a second for a page to reload, or the Spa app to go and fetch the data and update the content in the page. What SockShop does is it scrolls the page into the context that you're going to be focusing, fades the background and adds a spinner. Now that animation, like I said, buys us a quarter of a second to a half a second while this API call is being made, which means it feels a lot better than clicking the button and getting nothing for about a second, which is how long the whole process takes. So it's keeping that user engaged and creating certainty that the website has felt my click, it's understood my intent, and it's doing something based on that, fetching more stocks. Now, I don't know how many people would consider Amazon to be humane, but they are good at humanizing tasks. So on Amazon, you can buy products that are sold through third parties, which means that Amazon has to make an API call out to that third party to see if there is stock and what options are available. They know this task takes time. So what they do is they add a little message, rummaging around in the stock room, which really humanizes this task and makes you realize, it is actually having to go and work out what stock is available. But also it buys them maybe 200 milliseconds, the time it takes to read that text. Is this something new and it catches your eye? And so it works in two ways. One is to distract you for a little bit, but also to make you think, yeah, it's doing something that's important and takes time, so I'm willing to wait. Now, if you've ever used an insurance comparison website or a holiday comparison website, you'll know that they can be quite slow. And as kind of expert users, we understand that it's making hundreds of API calls out to third parties, collating all those results and sorting them and doing stuff with them. But for the average user, they expect everything to be quick. So here, Compare the Market, which is a UK company, they give you two things. One is, I'm getting you 91 quotes. It kind of makes you think, how long would it have taken me to fill in 91 forms to get those quotes back from all the individual insurance providers? And it gives us a status bar as well. This progress indicator tells us I'm almost done. And you'll notice it doesn't start at 0 and it doesn't end at 100. And it's not related to how many quotes are being fetched. It's just a psychological trick to make you feel like something is happening. Progress is being made. And one of my favorite ones, Auto Trader, is a UK third-party car sales place. And if I filter to Ford vehicles in the UK, my search button gets updated. And it says, I'm going to search 43,911 cars to find the one that you want. And psychologically, that makes me think, wow, that's a big amount of cars that it's going to have to search through to find me the results. And it turns out if you click on that, it's a really quick response. Obviously, they're optimized for searching listings, but it gives us a psychological hint that this might take a while because it's doing something that's important and it's a big task. So that's how we explain the value of the wait in that case. And you can combine all of these together. So Skyscanner is a holiday comparison site. It turns out that holidays in COVID times are actually quite cheap. So here I've got four things going on. One is a little activity spinner. That just tells me it's doing something. It doesn't actually have to mean anything. Second is it tells me its progress through the number of providers. And again, that's giving me the scale of the task they are trying to complete. To check through 19 different holiday providers and get me the best deal. We also have a progress indicator. But my favorite thing about this is it starts giving you prices straight away. So here you can see my cheapest is £12. And as more results come in, it'll tick down, maybe £11, maybe £10. And it gives us a little dopamine hit every time that happens. This constant feedback, filling that UX gap. For what is actually a 15-second delay, it feels exciting and it feels like part of your holiday. It's all coming in and you can see the prices drop down and it gets exciting to see what you can actually afford when you're going on holiday. Maybe wait till next year though. But we know things don't always go right. So what happens if that search took 10 seconds or 30 seconds? And these things do happen in the wild. And this is from another parenting book. Sometimes simply naming what the person is probably feeling is a way of communicating the validity of that feeling. Now, it's easy to forget when we're behind our screens that our visitors are humans, and even adults, such as kids in adult-shaped shells. And people just want to be validated. So this is a quote that was used in a study of frustration in playing games. In this study, they took a set of participants where a game they were playing would occasionally have delays. In a group of the participants, the delay was unacknowledged. In another group, the delay was acknowledged with a simple bit of text to say, sorry, you've had a delay. We'll try to do better next time. And the result of that was a 50% increase in gameplay time, just by acknowledging that the customer had a poor experience. There's another quote before that, which was, appreciate that offering no support for the user's emotional state during or after a system failure is tantamount to ignoring emotion, which can lead to a loss of opportunity for continued interaction. Now, again, this study was focusing on games, but that's no different from the web. We're competing with all sorts of different things to keep people's attention on our website. We want to deliver great experiences so people don't get bored, distracted, and switch off to something else. So simply acknowledging users' state, emotional state, can buy us some time, some emotional validity, helps customers stay on our websites, on the platforms. So how do we do that on the web? Well, if you have a long wait, say you're a car search engine or an insurance comparison website, measure how long it normally takes. And measuring it isn't as simple as it sounds, but we'll get to that in a second. Then work out a budget based on the worst case scenarios. So 90th, 95th percentile, maybe even the 99th. So if it's the 99th, you know that 1 out of 100 times will be slower than that. And that's where you want to set your threshold for showing an apologetic message. And it doesn't have to be, we're so sorry, here's 10% off your next purchase. It just has to acknowledge that the experience has been a bit slower. You can see that in the wild on Gmail. And they've just changed this UI actually with their rebrand. But if Gmail takes a little while to load, they'll say, this is taking longer than normal. Would you like to load the basic HTML view? And again, this is doing two different things, two psychological hacks. One is to acknowledge the emotional state. Checking your emails isn't generally a fun thing to do. It's transactional. You have to do it. So acknowledging that it's taking longer than usual validates your emotional state. The second thing is giving the user an option. They can take action, which gives them certainty that they're taking an action. And if it loads quicker, then it's a good thing. It doesn't matter because the user is in control. Now, I said measuring how long it takes isn't as simple as it should be. So this is the Transport for London website, which is the most popular route planning app for getting around London. You'll notice here that I'm going from my search page to my journey results. Now, you can watch, it takes about 4.7 seconds, which no, isn't crazy, but on a dodgy 3G connection walking around the underground, 4.7 could easily be 10. So from a user experience perspective, this took 4.7 seconds. But from a technical perspective that we usually take, when we look at the waterfall chart, we see that the API call took 2.449 seconds, 2.5 seconds. So from a technical perspective, this was a 2.5 second experience, but the user's perspective was 2 seconds longer because of all this stuff that has to be loaded beforehand. Now, this is mid-session, so it's with cached assets. So it's kind of the best case scenario, which means that when we measure user experiences for these kind of cases, like working out what our budget is for showing a message, we need to take into account the whole user experience, not just the back-end call that leads to the result shown on the screen. So to reduce unexplained waits, show something early, ideally your logo, so the customer knows you're on the right website. Humanize the wait with human language. Use progress indicators where appropriate, and acknowledge when the user experience is slow. Not just the backend is slow, but when the user experience is slow. So 5 top tips for happy users. Show something fast. Optimize your HTML delivery to be rendered as soon as it's received. Give instant feedback, and this is probably the easiest thing to implement. Use optimistic UI patterns where appropriate and where possible, and use progress indication. Let people know that you're doing something. That validates their emotional state. And explain long waits, whether it's a default explanation that this is going to take us a while because we're doing a lot of work for you, or explain that it's taking a bit longer than usual, but don't worry, we're still working on it. Takes me on to measuring waits in general. So we have 3 web wait types. We've got page loads, we've got in-app navigations, and then user actions. Now, 1 and 2 are relatively similar. It's traditional web performance measurements. When we look at those across, I took 1 billion experiences out of the Akamai Impulse dataset, and there's an inflection point in each of these distributions at which point people are less likely to leave or more likely to leave when the metric gets slower. And the cumulative layout shift, the goal is 0. The reason the goal is 0 is that we see a linear correlation between the layout shift on a landing page and the likelihood to bounce. Anything greater than 0 leads to more bounces. Then first input delay is giving something back to the user when they interact with the site. We know that this should be as quick as possible, and 50 milliseconds is about the boundary for when it starts to impact user engagement. And then the last three, FCP, LCP, and time to interactive, are more traditional performance measurements. Paint something within a second, paint the important stuff within 3 seconds, and then the time to interactive when the main thread is quiet should be no more than 500 milliseconds later than the largest contentful paint. That's because that's how long it takes for a customer to go, oh, it's ready, and try to interact. And if it's not interactive, then you get high first input delay, and you get frustrated users. Now, all of this is based on aggregate data across a billion experiences, and you can calculate this for yourself to work out where your goal should be for your users on your site. Now, if some of these metrics sound familiar, it may be because Google's been making a bit of a noise about them. Google has announced that the page experience update goes live in May, and that these 3 performance metrics will impact your ranking. They're also announcing that AMP is no longer a requirement for top stories, which is a great thing, but let's focus on these for now. So these 3 new metrics are proxies for user experience. All the metrics we have are proxies. But LCP is how fast the page appears to load. FID is how well the page interacts or responds to your interactions. And cumulative layout shift is how much the page shifts around as it loads. And this at initial glance, it seems like this is the holy grail. They've got 3 metrics which are really good representations, really good proxies for the speed of a user experience. And that's where we're trying to get to as an industry. But when you spend a bit more time digging into it, these proxies for user experience aren't the holy grail. For example, well, for the first case, they're only available on Chromium-based browsers, which kind of limits them to iOS Safari, Desktop Safari, Firefox. They're designed to be universal, so broadly applied across all websites, which may not mean they're good for your website and your users and the way your applications are designed. And my big concern with first input delay is it depends on a user interacting with your site, and it depends on when they interact. So if they interact when the main thread is busy, then you'll get a high FID. If they interact when the main thread is quiet, you'll get a low FID. So I think total blocking time, which is the sum of all the long tasks between first paint and largest paint, I think that will be a better metric in the future. So they're not the holy grail yet. But, oh yes, another thing. So the data that's used for the page experience update is taken from the Chrome Real User Experience report. And it doesn't support sparse soft navigations, which means that your largest contentful paint and your cumulative layout shift will be summed across the whole experience in-app. Hopefully they'll get that fixed before May. Otherwise, it might unfairly penalize single-page apps. But Core Web Vitals provide a bridge between business and tech. They may not be the best metrics for your application, but they're doing great things to raise the performance IQ of the average business. I think it's fair to say that the SEO teams have more budget than the performance optimization teams, and it gives us the opportunity to kind of tap into that, get more business involvement. And I think pretty much every customer I've spoken to in the last month is using these as KPIs for new projects, for performance improvement, and for new apps they're developing. So take them with a pinch of salt. I see it with tempered enthusiasm. Now, we talked about page load and in-app navigations. For user interactions, it's much more tricky. So we need to use the user timing API to mark the points in the user experience from the first interaction to when the experience is complete. So performance.mark when the spinner starts is a great way to measure when the user first feels like you're giving them something back. Performance.mark when the process is finished, and then create a measure which calculates the duration between those two. If you're not using the user timing API yet, I highly recommend you experiment with it. The data is available to JavaScript, so your analytics tools, and your real user monitoring tools. But it's also available to synthetic tools like speed curve, and web page test. For this, real user measurement is kind of critical. So a run tool lives in the browser, JavaScript that collects data for that user experience. Now, to make it actionable in this kind of environment, we want to support 100% data capture. The reason for that is you want to experiment with different tweaks for these performance hacks on maybe 1% or 10% of traffic. You need a statistically significant sample. And the less data you capture, the longer it'll take to do that. Custom percentile, so you can get the 99th percentile. So you can see what the almost worst case scenario is. Because optimizing for the median or the average may not shift the needle. What you really care about is taking people from the long end of that tail, bringing them closer to the normal of the distribution. Support for user timing is kind of essential if you want to track these individual user experience measurements throughout your engagement. And of course, we need to look at how long those back-end calls, those cart calls, those searches, those filters, how long they take from the user's browser to your backend and back again. Backend metrics just don't cut it in this case. I would have to pitch Pack My Impulse as a great solution for this. It's a real user measurement tool that collects all the core web vitals, and it does all those things I said. But there's also Speed Curve Lux, Dynatrace, App Dynamics, New Relic. If you have an APM in place, you should be able to turn on Run, if you don't get it already, to capture this data. Just make sure what you capture is valuable to your users, not just to you as application developers. All right, last section. How can we hack perceived weights to make weights feel less weighty? Now, a couple of these we've already covered, like the active state on buttons, but there's some more stuff we can do that's maybe a little more technically challenging, but gives good rewards. Now, one is events on buttons or links. Oftentimes, we'll attach the click event. When someone clicks, we perform an action. But when we have a nice animated button, it feels lovely to hover on, it buys us an extra 200 milliseconds of hover time as we get distracted by this animation, which means that when I click on it, working back from the click event that was fired, the mouse down, so the time it took me to press down and then release, is 150 milliseconds. Now that's a decent amount of time in the world of the web. And from hovering on the button to clicking, that's 3/4 of a second. Now, if there's something we can do asynchronously to prepare for the next event that the user is showing us their intent to perform, like downloading some images for the next stage, or preparing a form, or sending out a basket request, we can do that 3/4 of a second early. So by the time the user has finished their click event, we might be halfway there to processing that request. Obviously, it doesn't work with state because you can cancel a click, but for anything that isn't stateful, this is a great little trick. And there are plenty of JavaScript libraries which will help you implement this. Now, skeleton UI is a weird one. If you can do it well, and there's plenty of solutions for the different single page application frameworks, if you can do it well, it may make the app feel faster. The problem is that if it's not done well, for example, if the layout that you've created is slightly different from the final rendered layout, you'll create this kind of uncanny valley where it feels like the app is broken, and then it comes in, and then your users are a bit confused for half a second. It'll also increase your layout shift score. So when you can predict exactly what the layout will be, simply setting background colors on the layout elements can be a really cheap way to get a skeleton UI. If you can't predict exactly what the layout will be, stick with a spinner or a splash screen. And finally, non-linear progress indicators. So there's a study that I've linked to down here. And it turns out that the way a progress bar advances influences how fast it feels. So tell me which of these is the fastest and which is the slowest. Now that feels really slow. Whoosh. Still feeling quite slow. That felt fast to me. No, I think the last one was the fastest. Now, of course, you know this is a trick because although they advance at different paces, they all finish after exactly 7 seconds. Now, this is just super simple CSS, Bezier curves, linear, ease out, ease in, and ease in out. But if you experiment with this, you can design your loading indicators to make them feel faster. And if you get to 100% and the action hasn't completed, that's the perfect opportunity to say, hold on a second, it's taking a bit longer than expected. So your total duration should be set based on your data. So if the 75th percentile is 7 seconds, set your progress bar for 7 or 8 seconds, because the customer won't mind if your action is completed before the progress indicator comes to the end. Now, all of this can be done with super duper React libraries or Next.js libraries, plugins, but there's a lot in the platform that we can use. And I think we're kind of abstracting away from this platform that we have in the web, but we could use it to great effect. Native image lazy loading is a great progressive enhancement if you don't have lazy loading already. And it gives the browser time to prioritize bandwidth for the critical assets on the page, not all the mega menu images which it has to download, which aren't visible until you click on it. Responsive images with size attributes. There was an issue with this in Chrome for a while, but it's been fixed. You can have the right image sent to the right device with size attributes, so it doesn't have cause a layout shift. And you can render pure HTML. I mean, back in the 90s, that's all the web was pure HTML. But if you style it with a bit of critical CSS inlined, you can get a very good app shell in 4 or 5K of HTML and CSS, and then progressively add content as you can. And as we've seen, I love CSS animations. The pseudo selectors for active and hover are great opportunities for us to give some kind of validation back to our users, to let them know we've understood their intent. And link rel preload. I've seen it abused a lot. It's a bit like the poison chalice. When used right, and I think that's mainly just for web fonts, critical web fonts, it gives a great way to hint to the browser that this resource is high priority. But as with anything in the world, if everything's high priority, nothing is. So use preload for a maximum of 2 or 3 assets, the ones that you know the browser will need, but can't see straight away. So background CSS images and web fonts are the critical ones. But if you've done your critical HTML, the browser will know that it needs the font. At the same time, it sees the link rel preload, so it becomes unnecessary. If in doubt, experiment. This is easy stuff to play with, but please don't do it in the client. Please don't use Maximizer, Optimizely, Google Optimize, any of the front-end libraries for experimentation. The reason being is that they break the website, they break performance. Anti-flicker scripts hide stuff, and it will mess your results up. So all the 3 major CDNs, Akamai, Fastly, and Cloudflare, let you run JavaScript or anything at the edge. So you can make these modifications, tune these experiments at the edge of the CDN, and collect that data back in your RAM or your analytics. That way you don't have to worry about your origin releases, well, you can do it there as well, of course. But as long as it's not running client-side JavaScript, experiment away and find which tweaks and which changes improve business outcome. And that's the only real measure we have of the psychology, the user experience that we're delivering. If people spend longer on the site, spend more money, view more ads. And with that, I'll say thank you. I blog about this all the time on simonhand.com, and these slides are up on simonhand.com/talks. If you have any more questions that we don't cover today, reach out on Twitter as well. I'll be happy to chat. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Simon. It was amazing. I mean, frankly, I would say it's the best presentation I've heard about performance for a long time, because this is reality. This is real users. We are talking about people using computers, right? And that's basically like really exciting for me, because I'm actually working in a lot of similar things, and we probably need to chat more, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you for the feedback.
We do have a few questions already. And folks, yeah, feel free to leave them in a comment. I see a question from Ariel. How about the practice of using animation effects to soften the impact of CLS for a skeleton loader, for example?
So it depends on how you're calculating CLS, but assuming that you mean an element gradually growing to fill the space, the layout shift score is calculated by how much changes and how far it moves across the viewport. So animating it doesn't change the layout shift. It may make it feel better to a user, but if you're measuring just that simple metric, should be the same, unless you know of a case where it wouldn't be. And this is the challenge with using these metrics as overall proxies for user experience. There may be something we can do which makes the experience feel better, but inflates a metric like CLS. So yeah, experiment, I think, see what the outcome is from your user's perspective.
Yeah, Ariel said that's what they do. Exactly. So I actually have a question. You mentioned that um, we have a good opportunity to talk to business right now, like, and kind of a lot of businesses starting to use KPI performance as KPIs because of Google's push for Web Vitals and whatever other reasons. Maybe we finally pushed through a big wall a little bit. How can we do that? I mean, is there any process within the business that can improve to be more proactive in doing this kind of work?
I can relate it back to where I've seen success in the past. And that's generally when there's a product owner, a digital product owner who spans, the business success and the technical success of the product. So the website, the app. And if they understand the value and then share it across their teams, that's where we get success. What we're probably going to see over the next few months is more top-down pressure. Say, why are we red in the core web vitals? We're going to suffer for this. Fix it. And we get this performance police process, which it can help improve metrics, but unless the company is invested in tracking it long-term and invested in improving it across the board, then it's generally a kind of a spot project that lasts for a month, and then the team is disbanded and performance will degrade again over the next 6 months. So it has to be a core focus. And performance as a feature rather than as a project, I think, is the only way you can do that. So it has to be something that's continually worked on rather than occasionally checked and people get beaten up for a while as it gets fixed.
Okay, another question. How interstitial pop-ups affect LCP? May Google consider a pop-up that includes a large image, a largest, most meaningful piece of content?
Yeah, for sure. You also get penalized in the page experience up or the page experience signal for having a large interstitial page as well. So if it's the biggest thing painted on the screen, it depends, funnily enough. So when you close that interstitial, the next largest contentful paint may be the hero image behind it, in which case that would supersede the previous LCP measurement. And the way that Google measures this is throughout the life cycle of the page, from first paint to page hide, so when you navigate away or close the tab. So if there's another big paint later on, that will become the new LCP. And of course, that could push out your LCP time significantly. So these are some of the questions we have about how they're going to implement this and optimize it in the future to make sure it doesn't unfairly penalize certain app designs. The easiest way to check is to run page speed insights on a page that has one and see where it says the LCP is. Or in the Experience tab on Chrome DevTools, it'll now show you which element was classed as the LCP element and why. So there's a few, in the latest version of Chrome, 88, DevTools has a bit more about layout shifts, LCP and attribution for LCP as well. So time to get digging into DevTools.
I actually have another follow-up. So you mentioned that RUM is great, and I'm not the person to say no. I love great data. I love knowing real user information. But at the same time, we have a lot of challenges with a lot of metrics moving. Instrumentation itself is an expensive and timely matter. And oftentimes, I meet people here at the meetup that say, like, it's overwhelming. We just cannot really know all of this information. And I feel like analysis of this data is in particularly hard as well. Because it's a lot of data. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah.
Is there any way to still do better without knowing the data?
We'll do better without knowing the data. Yeah, so one of the easy things to do if you care about Core Web Vitals is to use the Chrome UX dashboard, which shows you your vitals over time and shows you whether they're improving or degrading. So you can make changes that you know will be positive and measure them from Google's eyes. But back to your point about the data, I totally agree, because the data that you care about changes by page, it changes by device type. There's so many segmentations that it's almost overwhelming to work out what you should care about and why. I think there's a talk from Etsy at a VelocityConf in 2017, maybe. They said, if it moves, we track it just in case it, or even if it doesn't move, we'll track the metric just in case it tries to move. The problem is that most companies don't have that scale of analytics and monitoring. And so maybe it's worth just simplifying down to one or two key metrics that you know are important to user experience through testing and tracking them through a simple homebrew setup using Perfume.js and Elasticsearch and using Kibana for dashboards. You can do it DIY and get value. And especially if you're paying a lot of money for data and not getting value out of it, it's time to work out whether you can get more value out of it or go to a more simple solution. But I think in the end, if you focus on good user experience, that should get you the majority of the way. And a lot of people have this data and don't focus on good UX. So you can get leaps and bounds ahead just by caring about the experiences you're delivering.
Yeah, completely agree. Caring is what makes the whole difference, I think. Question from Ala. What do you think of carousels? What if carousel is only moving upon the user's choice? Is it still bad for CLS?
So a CLS, a carousel that moves automatically shouldn't impact CLS because it's not a layout shift. It's just moving. Depends how it's implemented. I'm personally not a fan of carousels. I think why hide content and force users to interact with something to get to that content? But yeah, if they are giving you layout shifts when they're automatically rotating, then there might be a way around it using transform rather than a JavaScript movement. But I would test removing the carousel and see if your user satisfaction, your business success improves.
Yeah, I feel sometimes we are concentrating too much on the Google's definition of impact, and partially because like our previous session was about SEO, SEO and performance. So SEO is a big power in this field, in the web field, and Google wields a pretty Google search. I mean, wields a pretty powerful hammer out there, and the cookie as well, and at the same time, remember, user experience is what matters. Metrics are proxies for it. Yes, Google might penalize you, but your users will be happier. And frankly, Google probably will not penalize you for things that make your users happier. I know, no one knows the magical formula, but that's basically how I feel about those contradictory things that are hard to work around usually.
And it's, I think, fair to assume that the Core Web Vitals impact will be really quite small. If you have good content, a fast time to first byte, and a secure website, then having a poor LCP or a poor CLS is probably not going to affect your ranking in any meaningful way. I wouldn't say that to business folks when I'm trying to extract budget for these projects, but in the real world, it's unlikely they're going to, drop you off page 1 because your CLS is 0.2. So I think, yeah, a pinch of salt to be taken with these metrics.
And it's not to shame or like bash Google. Frankly, the amount of work they're churning out, trying to automate things that are very hard to measure and hard to do, is enormous, right? And all of this work is not done to punish us. This work is done to make it easier for us to do the analysis, to do tracking and everything. So no matter how much we can be frustrated as engineers trying to do that, this is amazing work, right? Like I don't want it to be perceived wrong too.
Yeah.
And one more question from Ala. About the videos, actually. She's talking about GIFs and MP4s. and will MP4 affect Web Vitals or not? And does video in general impact performance?
Yeah, so video elements are in scope for LCP. So if your hero element is a video, then I think it's when the poster is rendered or the first frame, that will be your LCP value. So there's quite an easy way around that, potentially, which is to have an image placeholder rather than the video poster attribute and load the video player on interaction. So if it's not an autoplay requirement, then there's some easy ways to get around the LCP impact. But again, it's all to try to improve the user experience. So if that video has the preload attribute set correctly, so it downloads the first frame and can render that quickly, then you can get away with a great experience with a reasonable quality video without suffering a penalty with user experience or LCP. But the video preload attributes, if you're using HTML5 video, give us quite a lot of control over that. Animated GIFs, less so.
You mentioned the splash screen is a good UX for initial loading. However, it's possibly would result in a significant CLS, more than 0, because most of the screen would change once the content is available. Is the metric correct?
I don't know. Something to test. So there's a risk you'd get. I don't know. So the element disappears, which means you don't have a layout shift is a product of how much the element changes and how much the viewport is impacted. So the whole viewport would be impacted, so you get a 1. But if the element isn't changing, it's just disappearing, it might be 0 times 1. So the layout shift score would be 0. Again, it's worth experimenting. And even if it does give you a CLS hit, it's only on the first view. It's only on the landing page hit. And assuming your session length is more than 1, it means your overall average CLS, or your 75th percentile, which is what Google uses, should be weighed towards the positive experiences. But then again, if you just had a single tiny little icon, an SVG icon that was embedded in the HTML, and it was only as big as it needed to be, that would also minimize the potential layout shift. So yeah, good question. One we'll need to test.
I also find the conversation around the skeletal designs often goes basically like, well, we designed the skeleton, is it good? And the answer is usually like, did you predict, do you know what layout will be? Skeleton is supposed to preserve the layout. It's not just something moving that is not real content. It might be more frustrating. I mean, it's obviously, better than nothing, right? But is it much better? So this should be designed with the user in mind, in my opinion, all the time. And sometimes skeleton design is not the best solution, as you mentioned, right? Like where you cannot predict what the layout would be, like for some advanced search things that can bring you any result, right? Or those kind of examples.
And then just the menu bar with your logo and maybe a loading spinner is going to give you a better experience than a skeleton UI that doesn't match the eventual content.
Yeah, and by the way, the Slack's solution is amazing. I mean, not every business can create such a brand to accomplish that, but I feel that, and the Amazon's going through the inventory message, yeah, some humor can work pretty well, and even in a very serious context, you can be like informative and distract a person from having nothing on the screen.
Yeah. One corollary to that is the new Salesforce Lightning UI, which is called Lightning but is painfully slow, has some humorous messages in it, and that feels really out of place with a workforce productivity application. And also with your locale and language as well. So some jokes will not translate. Some humor, if you're working in some Asian countries, humor is not appropriate in a web application. So it's certainly something to treat with caution. I think with the US and UK, you're okay using a significant amount of humor, but it doesn't translate globally. Thank you for having me. Hope to see you all in real life at some point in the next few years.